Now that the Renters' Rights Act is in force, the only way we can increase rent for an assured periodic tenancy is by following the Section 13 process and serving the new Form 4A. No other method works. However, as we've been finding out, Form 4A is a bit tricky and it's been causing a lot of head scratching. And in this video, I'm going to show you how I think we should be filling it in. I also explain what you need to know about the Section 13 process as amended by the Renters' Rights Act. If you'd like a written guide, it's on my website on this link, theindependentlandlord.com/section-13. I'm Suzanne Smith, lawyer turned landlord, and I'm the author of the best-selling book, The Good Landlord Handbook, published by Penguin, which goes through every stage of the tenancy, including rent increases, explaining how to operate successfully as a landlord under the Renters' Rights Act. I also run the Independent Landlord website and this YouTube channel, and you can sign up for my free Friday newsletter to keep up to date on theindependentlandlord.com/subscribe. Right. What changed on the 1st of May 2026? Well, that's when the tenancy reforms came into effect, and this included the way that we can increase rent for assured periodic tenancies. And all tenancies that were assured short-hold tenancies became assured periodic tenancies on that day. If you want to increase rent for an assured periodic tenancy, which includes all those pre-1st of May ASTs that turned into APTs on the 1st of May, then you must use the Section 13 process using Form 4A. And this rule holds true even if your tenancy agreement says you can do it by another method, for instance, a rent review clause. All rent review clauses are now null and void. So to have a valid rent increase, we must answer all the relevant questions on Form 4A and just leave it blank where it's not relevant. Also, make sure you do use the new Form 4A, as the previous one, Form 4, has now been superseded. And every time you do a rent increase, do go back and download the up-to-date one from gov.uk because they do change the forms from time to time. If you scroll down to Form 4A, click on the link and it will bring up a PDF document for you to complete. It's one of those fillable PDFs. Most of it's self-explanatory, but there are a few tricky bits, and it's important to get them right so that the tenants can't challenge the validity of the notice. So the first bits are okay, the names of the tenants, you put all the joint tenants, the property address, who it's from, landlord or letting agent, and the landlord should match what's on the tenancy agreement. And you put in the current rent, the frequency, that's all straightforward. Then it gets a bit trickier. How to answer question 4.3? Well, 4.3 asks you to complete the following. The most recent rent increase, if applicable, was on insert date. That sounds pretty straightforward, but it's actually not, because it doesn't say we should only enter the last rent increase using the Section 13 process, which before the 1st of May would have been using Form 4. It just says the most recent rent increase. And there's been a lot of confusion and debate about this, with some saying if you've never used Section 13 to increase the rent before, but did it say by a rent review clause, addendum, or even by text, then you can leave it blank. I'm not so sure about that, as the words are clear. The most recent rent increase. It doesn't say apart from X, Y, and Z. It just asks for the most recent rent increase. From my experience as a solicitor, not as a housing lawyer, but as somebody who worked in business for 25 years, when something's unclear, I look at the natural meaning of the words without inserting something in it that isn't there. Of course, we won't ultimately know what the answer is to this until the upper tribunal issues a decision. But in the meantime, here's what I think is logical and the approach that gives the most information to the tenant and the First-tier Tribunal about what's happened in the past. So I would enter the date that the rent was last increased, whether using the Pre-Renters' Rights Act Section 13 process, using the old Form 4, by addendum, or following a rent review clause or any other method. And if you haven't increased the rent since the beginning of the tenancy, including its renewal, because that is a new tenancy, and before the 1st of May 2026, then leave it blank. I also suggest this because not only does it answer the question on the form, but also because if it's left blank and the rent has been increased, it's more likely that the tenant will challenge the increase on the grounds that the form is incorrect, and that will delay a rent increase coming into effect. So on balance, I think it's better to fill it in, because I think it's better to give too much information than not enough information. But we'll have to see what the upper tribunal decides on that. The next question is 4.4, and a very similar issue arises there. There's a very opaque instruction that says the landlord must enter the first rent increase date after the 11th of February 2003. It's a bizarre question. The reason for this is because of an odd quirk for weekly tenancies. So to stop landlords from gaining an extra increase, bringing it forward, new rent start date cannot be more than 6 days before the anniversary of the date in question, 4.4. And that's the first increase in rent since the 11th of February 2003. This isn't something new in the Renters' Rights Act, but it's something that was in the previous Form 4. If this isn't the first time you've increased rent using Section 13, either the old Form 4 or in the future the new Form 4A, then it's easy. Just put the date of the first time you increased rent using Section 13. For instance, if you serve the then Form 4 notice on the 20th of March 2022 to come into effect on the 25th of April 2023, you would put the 25th of April 2023 into question 4.4. If this is the first time that you've used Section 13 and you have increased the rent via another method in the past, you could leave it blank and hope for the best, believing it's only intended to capture rent increases using Section 13. However, I think that there's a strong argument to say that if you leave it blank when you did increase rent by an addendum or whatever, you've not answered the question on the form. And it's also more likely to be flagged by the tenant, as I said before. So I think it's less risky to insert the date that you increased rent for the first time via any method after 2003 as you're answering a question on the form. And if you've never increased rent since you signed the original tenancy agreement or a renewal AST, then leave it blank. The next question is 4.6. What is the starting date for the new rent? Section 13 of the Housing Act 1988 states that the new rent must start on the beginning of a new period of the tenancy. Now, how much notice does a landlord need to give to increase the rent when they use Section 13? Well, under the Renters' Rights Act, a landlord needs to give a minimum of 2 months' notice before the date of the proposed increase to the rent. And how to serve the notice? Well, you can serve it by first-class post, hand delivery, or via an official process server. If you do serve it by first-class post, then do get a certificate of posting from the post office. It just makes things easier. Now, how can tenants challenge a rent increase? Well, if tenants don't agree to the new rent in the Form 4A notice, they can challenge the notice at the First-tier Tribunal. However, they do need to do this before the date the rent increase is due to come into effect. So to appeal a notice, they need to submit Form 1, which asks detailed information about the property, rooms, facilities, type of property, furniture, repairs. How will the First-tier Tribunal decide on what the rent should be? The First-tier Tribunal will set a rent for the property, and to do this, they will assess what rent the property would reasonably achieve if they let it on the open market under a new tenancy on the same terms. And they have the power either to keep the rent the same, as the landlord proposes in Form 4A, or to reduce it to a lower amount if they determine that the open market rent is less. The tenant needs to pay the court fee of £47 to challenge the rent increase, and they keep paying the old rent until the tribunal makes a decision. The First-tier Tribunal can also take into account any repairs that the landlord should have taken care of. Additionally, they can take account of the value of any improvements that the tenant has made themselves. if the tenant's appeal is successful, any change in the rent will start on the next rent date following the decision by the First-tier Tribunal. However, the tribunal can delay the rent increase by a further 2 months in the event they believe the rent increase would cause undue hardship to the tenant. And the Renters' Rights Act changed this rule because previously the tribunal could backdate it to when it was supposed to have come into effect. Now, how often can landlords increase rent using a Section 13 notice? Well, they can do it once every 52 weeks. And when will the rent come into effect? If they don't appeal it to a tribunal, well, it comes into effect on the proposed start date in box 4.6 in the form. And if they don't do anything, they don't do an appeal, then it's automatically enforced. There's a lot to take in with the Renters' Rights Act, and because the Renters' Rights Act has made significant changes to the way we run our businesses, and we're changing at every stage of the tenancy. And my best-selling book, that is published by Penguin, and the Good Landlord Handbook, it's the only book out there that combines a legal mind with direct experience of the practicalities of being a landlord. You can also keep up to date for free if you sign up for my Friday newsletter at theindependentlandlord.com/subscribe. If you have any questions, you can ask me them at my twice monthly live streams in my membership, the Independent Landlord Hub, along with templates, including APTs, checklists, and courses. Come and join us, and see you soon, and hopefully in the Hub.